Hello, and today we're going to talk about the Age of Enlightenment, the age of reform, the age of reason, as many have termed it since then. Age of Enlightenment, we're talking about the 18th century, and we're talking about particularly a number of thinkers who will build on the thought, the ideas of some earlier people we've met, from Montaigne and René Descartes, for example. So let's continue with that. The problem of the 18th century is that people are looking for a new basis for knowledge. Where does knowledge come from? And they're no longer going to rely on revelation. By now, Christianity, the church at least, has come under considerable pressure. And many of the thinkers of the 18th century are looking for a new foundation of knowledge, and they believe they find it. It's not divine law, it's not revelation, it's not scripture, it's human reason. And human reason can perceive what people of the age call the reason. They can perceive natural laws, and reason is based on that. Reason can discover those natural laws. So it's nature is the basis of reason. Nature becomes the object of thought, of the discovery of natural laws. So there will be a number of problems, of course, in the 18th century. If you deny, as they did, authority, if you deny received wisdom, if you deny revelation, then it's up to you to decide what the foundations are. It's up to you to decide how you actually know something, how people come to know something, the base of knowledge. And one of the answers was provided by John Locke, who believes that all knowledge it's not innate. Knowledge is based on human perception. It's based on human experience. And essentially knowledge is generalizing from that experience and trying to come up with just a sort of a general idea, general laws based on that. Now Locke will also believe in natural laws in other senses, for example, human liberties, but let me come back to that. What I want to talk about first has to do with morality, good and evil. After all, that seemed to be quite simple when you go back to Scripture, if you go back to Revelation. Good and evil are more or less defined in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. But in any case, there has to be a new idea, a new foundation of good and evil. And that's what, for example, John Locke, the English philosopher who lived mostly in the 17th century, believes that he has found. He believes that it's based on the principle of good and evil, based on the principles of pleasure and pain. So he's looking essentially for a naturalistic foundation. And others will more or less come to the same conclusion. Thomas Hobbes also believes there is some connection between pleasure and good and pain and evil. Obviously there are some difficulties with that because it's not very clear what exactly is going to give someone pleasure, if it's really going to be good or not. So it seems relative, and many have said that it was. Not a perfect, not a perfect solution. Others will have other solutions. For example, the philosopher Baruch Spinoza says, well, let's simplify things. Let's say that there's not, as René Descartes had argued back in the 17th century, for dualism, the distinction between thought and extension, or mind and matter. Spinoza says, well, let's put God back into nature. In fact, let's just call God everything, all-encompassing, eternal, omnipresent, and therefore there's only one substance, and we're all part of this sort of this divine substance. That's what he thought. That's what he said. And the argument is, in his Ethics, which, by the way, if you accept the first premise, is very difficult to disagree with him. His argument is that since we're all contained in this one essence, since we're all part of this sort of divine essence, that we will essentially follow the good as opposed to the evil. It almost seems as if there can't be evil if there's only one substance defined by God. Leibniz, the German philosopher, of course, will take this in a somewhat different direction. He will simply say that what appears to be evil is not actually evil at all. God, of course, would not create a universe in which there was evil. Therefore, when we think there's something evil, well, it's not really as bad as that. It's only because we have a limited perception. Not a clear definition, not a way, sort of foundation as to how to act, not at all. In fact, Voltaire will pillory this in Candide, and he will make a mockery of the ideas of Leibniz. So it's clear that it was very difficult to find a new a new foundation. If you're going to deny original sin, as these thinkers did, then you have to explain why things at least appear to be evil. You can't just say that they aren't, as Leibniz had said. So they have a problem. Now, what many philosophers will end up saying, of course, is that such things as crime and evil actually are the result of social institutions, of political institutions, the maldistribution of property, the concentration of wealth in too few hands. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And therefore, one has to simply modify those institutions. One should perhaps distribute wealth in a different way. And so there are solutions. People will look toward social institutions as ways to perhaps modify human behavior and make social institutions fair so that people might not be driven to crime. Let me take a look at politics and the basis of the state, because here we have some quite original ideas, and in particular John Locke again, whose years, by the way, are 1632, 1704. John Locke, who was himself a fairly wealthy man, and he was in fact one of the principals of the Providence companies, which helped develop that colony, Rhode Island, of course, as we all know. In any case, he comes up with a theory which rejects divine kingship, which rejects divine law as the basis of political authority and political power. What does he say is that basis? Well, basically there are natural laws, again, for Locke. And Locke argues that those laws essentially can be encompassed more or less in one phrase: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he finds that these are things that people have in a state of nature before there is a state. So what he wants to do, he wants to say that the most fundamental things of all are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, by which he means essentially property, by which he means essentially landed property. So those things exist in what he calls the state of nature. And the problem is that everything is perfect in the state of nature because everybody uses whatever they need in order to take care of themselves. But if some are doing better than others, they're always at risk that somebody might attempt to defraud them or take from them the fruit of their own labors. And so he develops the notion that the state should actually be a contract between the people and the monarch. Of course, this reflects the revolution of 1689 very much in England, which was a revolt against the monarchy, which imposes a sort of a constitution and a Bill of Rights on the monarch and limits the powers of the king. And that was exactly what Locke had talked about before, and exactly what is in his civil treatise that he is actually published in 1689. So this states that the king is not a social, but is in a contract with the people, right? And the purpose of organizing the state is to protect what people already have by natural right: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The establishment of the state, in other words, is there to protect people's property. And this is a sort of naturalistic idea of Locke. Some would say, well, he's just creating a state in order to protect his property and those who are like them. Maybe. But this is still a very historic moment, because Locke is saying that everybody's entitled to whatever they produce with their own labor, and everybody has rights. And if those rights are not guaranteed by the state, then people have the right of revolution against the state. That's an enormously important idea. And as a matter of fact, it's a very important idea for the United States, for the later United States, which will enshrine in its own Bill of Rights much the same idea. You have other philosophers, very important too. The Baron Charles Montesquieu argues that the purpose of the state, the purpose of political power and political authority, is essentially to protect the historic liberties, and he's talking about the aristocracy. He worried that the monarchy would have too much power. So he comes up with the idea of the division of power, which he also believes is part of natural law. It does not go back to divine law, but it's natural law. the division of power is the best way to preserve natural law. Natural law is essentially the idea that, that the state, the people in society should be in sort of in a balance or harmony. And the best way to preserve that harmony, which is part of nature, as he said, is to divide power, to divide political authority between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative bodies. Those three bodies, those three institutions shall divide power, and that's the best way of making sure that no one of those institutions has too much power to threaten the liberties, the rights of people. So this is yet another step which, of course, we've enshrined in our own political institutions, in our own government, in our own history here in the United States. And then let me mention Jean-Jacques Rousseau as well. Rousseau, of course, much more of a populist figure. Father was a cooper. He made barrels, wooden barrels. For example, he comes from a working class background. He's an autodidact, which means that he's self-educated. And he notices, he looks around in France, and of course he's writing in about mid-century, and he writes something called The Social Contract, which was published, I believe, around 1762. And in that social contract, he argues that the real sovereign power must be the people, and by the people he means everybody. And of course, he's thinking mostly of men, but this is still the 18th century, remember. But he believes that all people share the sovereign power, and that it should not belong to one person, the monarch. It should not belong to the aristocracy, those privileged few landowners and nobles, but it should belong to all the people. It's a very revolutionary idea. It's a very populist idea. And Rousseau, coming from this kind of working class background, believes it's the only way to really, it's the only legitimate foundation of political power. And so he argues for a social contract, and that's not an agreement between the king and the people. That's an agreement among the people themselves that what is really the ultimate aim of political power is to serve the common good, and the common good can only be served if property is more or less distributed fairly and evenly. So he's not about simply preserving the institution of private property, such as Locke had been so concerned about. He's about making sure that the common good, which means that nobody should be able to, or no group should be able to sort of concentrate property in their hands, but the common good means more or less that one word that the French Revolution will take up, égalité, egalitarianism, equality. And that is the thing that Rousseau really propounds. That's the principle that he preserves and promotes more than anything else. So what you have in the 18th century, the Enlightenment, in terms of politics, democracy, human rights, and notice we're also talking about sovereignty. Sovereignty actually belongs to all the people. The use of power shall be for the good of the common good and not just for a portion of the population. This is the foundation of really liberty, equality, fraternity that the French Revolution will take up. Was the French Revolution influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau? No doubt it was. Many of the ideas that people fought for certainly go back to the ideas of Rousseau, and that includes even the more radical parts of the revolutionaries. So that's the political. I won't talk about the economy. Adam Smith, I will let you look at that yourselves. However, let me just say that Adam Smith, who's often regarded as the founder of capitalism, so to speak, was really against monopoly, because what he came across in his age was something called mercantilism. Mercantilism essentially was a period in which monopolies were given to specific companies, which meant restraint of trade. He was against these monopolies because this is what actually closed down trade. This is what actually limited it to the privileged few. So it's not so much that he was proposing capitalism, that is a market solution to everything. What he was really wanting to get at was that monopolies were wrong. So he's often cited as the father of capitalism, but he also wrote something called The Theory of Moral Sentiment, in which he says that human beings are not really motivated by greed. they're actually, or self-interest, they're actually motivated more by caring, by virtue. He really believed that. And he believed that, in fact, if capitalism wasn't working, if the markets weren't working as they should, and some were left out, they should be taken care of. This is also part of Adam Smith, so that should be noted as well. So let me summarize up the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment looks for a new basis, a new foundation of knowledge. The Enlightenment defends such things as popular sovereignty. The Enlightenment says that people are not limited because of original sin, but they can improve themselves through education. So really, that's why it's called the Age of Enlightenment, and indeed some of these Enlightenment figures did try to enlighten these despots who were ruling in Prussia and Russia at the time. Not with a good deal of success. Catherine the Great in Russia wasn't about to listen to Voltaire, nor was Frederick the Great. And that's it for now. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.